Good evening. My name is Jody James, and I am the president of I had to think about what I was these days, but I have something above my head. It says I am the president of Florida Cannabis Action Network. Ergo, I believe it. Welcome to an interesting program that we're going to be doing over the next few months. And that's conversations on cannabis, communicating on cannabis. I'm sorry, communicating on cannabis. And our objective is to explore some of these topics that are controversial, maybe explore some of the topics that we don't have a firm position on, or maybe something that we have a really firm position on, and get some dialogue going so that we can come up with some language that we can use to be persuasive. If we can't persuade each other on some of these topics, how are we ever going to go out and articulate what's happening to the next person? So tonight's topic is going to be Schedule 1, Cannabis Schedule 1, and the federal, we'll call it a move to reschedule cannabis to Schedule 3. We have two people who are going to be our experts this evening. I asked Dr. Barry Gordon to join us. We love Dr. Barry Gordon. Not only does he participate regularly as a member of our advisory board, but he's that doc that you can count on to go to Tallahassee and take his own time at his own expense and speak on behalf of patients and small practitioners. So he's not a doc in a box. He is a doctor that wants to help patients get the best out of their treatment, and he's not unfamiliar with prescribing drugs. So the other guest expert that we're going to talk to tonight also comes from Florida Cannabis Action Network, actually probably Cannabis Action Network at large. Mike Crowitz has joined our board of directors in 2022, though he had served on the Florida Can Advisory Board for maybe a couple decades. I hate to out you, Mike. For those of you who have not seen Mike Crowitz's work, we have some quotes on him on our veterans brochure because 15 years ago already, we were talking about how veterans could talk to their doctors about cannabis. Doctors and veterans in medically legal states could use cannabis without fear. And a lot of that was work that Mike Crowitz did. But we invited him here today because of the work he's been doing at the United Nations and the work that he has been doing kind of more locally on rescheduling. I'll note that in the audience today, we have two plaintiffs from the last federal rescheduling lawsuit. Kathy Jordan and Mike Crowitz were both in the room there when now Attorney General, oh my goodness, his name escapes me, then Judge Kathy knows it.
Barrett Garland. We just talked about it this morning.
That's right, Garland. Kathy knew it, but she was on mute. So I don't want to take up a whole lot more time. I asked Dr. Gordon to talk primarily about what is Schedule 3 now, what's that mean to doctors, who has it, who gets it. So we're not talking in a vacuum. Dr. Barry Gordon, would you talk to us a little bit about Schedule 3 drugs and what's a Schedule 3 drug? And we know marijuana is good, so we got that one.
No, listen, I was an emergency physician, as I think most people know, and for 35 years up in Ohio. Prescribing narcotics was a normal part of every emergency doctor's day. But the great thing about what we did was that our pens never went past 20. So somebody came in with a pain issue, and there's a tracking system for scheduled medicines, and we'll get into the schedule in a second. I'll be honest with you, I can't wait to hear Mike speak, because I think Mike knows so much more about the schedules, having worked with and around. All I know is that I was an honorable physician for years and years and years, and cannabis consumer. and never would have thought about writing a illegal prescription, for myself, for anybody else. And, that's an important part of it. The utilization of cannabis is much use than the abuse of drugs. But as a physician, every 3 years or two, I think it is, I have to reapply through the DEA for my right to prescribe scheduled drugs. It's interesting, Mike, and everybody, I looked at the schedule today because I haven't written, and I'm proud to say, everybody, a narcotic in over 6 years. I wrote an Ativan prescription for somebody whose family member passed away, but I haven't written for really any of the scheduled. I couldn't believe when I looked that Ativan and Xanax and all that, I forgot, are actually Schedule 4 medicines. And if you look at the schedules, and I actually printed them off today, but I'm sure everybody knows these things. Schedule 1, no medical use with potential for abuse. Schedule 2 do have medical use, but high potential for abuse. 3, medical use with moderate potential for abuse. And then you get to 4, which are Ativan and Xanax and all that, the benzos and others. Gabapentin is a 5. I couldn't believe it when I saw that. So, and that's well known to be, a drug that people are abusing. So it's crazy. It makes no sense, as many people may or may not know. And then I'm going to shut up for a bit. This is all a result of politics, of course. The schedule did not exist until 1970 or so. Retired Governor Richard Schaefer of Pennsylvania was appointed by Richard Nixon. Mike, correct me, you probably know all this history, maybe a little better than I, but it was a 9-4 Republican versus Democratic panel, I believe. And retired Governor Schaefer was Republican, but the panel came back with a recommendation about cannabis, not to schedule cannabis, treat it like alcohol, the taxation or regulation. But Ehrlichman or Haldeman, one of the two, testified literally in committee that, Richard Nixon stated he needs a drug war against blacks, Hispanics, college students. And for cannabis, it fit the bill for a lot of those, parties. So, he ripped up the report, threw cannabis into Schedule 1. And here we are all those years later with cannabis still regarded as no medical use or value in research, with a high potential for abuse. And, once again, we could list the other drugs that are in Schedule 1, but we don't have to. So crazy.
So Schedule 3, but other drugs that are Schedule 3. And
so
now
Schedule 3, sure, that's your codeine. There used to be Darvocet, codeine, Darvocet. I have them. Like I said, I printed them off. They're in my bag, but hydrocodone, for example, oxycodone, the other narcotics, they're Schedule 2s. Tramadol, interesting, I think, fell into Schedule 4. So, there's no rhyme or reason, quite frankly, to the extent of danger. And it's crazy, but, 3s are 3s. 3s are kind of in the mid-range. And once again, the Ativan, Xanax, benzos are 4s. And they're well known. And of course, with a couple of glasses of wine and a couple, listen, when they put benzos into 4 with no potential for abuse, I guess nobody ever heard of a 2 milligram Xanax bar, and we know that there's been significant abuse, from benzodiazepines, So, like I said, there's drugs that will kill you if you take too much, especially in combination with alcohol, that are Schedule 4. So it makes no sense. But 3, and I'm going to wander over to my bag so I can grab the list, because I know people are probably interested in what other drugs are in there. Because I did print it off. Yeah.
If I'm hearing you correctly, the trigger is that potential for abuse.
It is the potential for abuse. Yeah. And, once again, right. But the thing about cannabis is that, it was lumped into Schedule 1, once again, with well-known knowledge that through the years there had been medical use. I mean, you have to go All right, here's the Schedule 3s. Let's see. Some examples are products containing less than 90 milligrams of codeine, Tylenol with codeine. Ketamine's a Schedule 3. Anabolic steroids are Schedule 3. And testosterone are Schedule 3. Schedule 4 would be Xanax, Soma, which is an unbelievably sedating drug, a muscle relaxer, horrible old drug. Darvon and Darvocet, Valium, Ativan, Tolwyn, which is another old synthetic narcotic, Ambien for sleep, and Tramadol. Fives, once again, Lyrica, which is, for nerve pain and the like, all over the place. Lamotil for diarrhea, Robitussin AC, and things like that. So, there's no rhyme or reason.
Well,
Adderall, hang on, Adderall, Ritalin, those things, because they're stimulants. Schedule 2, fentanyl, Duragesic patch, which is what that would be. Those are Schedule 2. And of course, oxycodone, Demerol, Dilaudid, those are methadone. Those are all Schedule 2.
Now, Schedule 2. And none of those drugs that you named can be obtained legally without someone with a DEA license making a prescription. And you have to, when you prescribe it, you have to put an exact dose, exact number. There are several things that have to go on that piece of paper. And what are those?
Well, you have to write it out, not just a number, but you have to write the entire script out. Of course, you have to have your DEA number on the script. You're only allowed to write for a certain amount. And I guarantee you that there's people on this call that know a hell of a lot more than I do about it, because those rules change all the time. Now, after a hospitalization or a surgery, you're only allowed to get, I think, a 3-day supply, or maybe at most a 7-day supply. Anything that is a chronic type of usage, you have to be in through a pain management environment. So, it's very much different than it was in the old days. Like I said, now here's the interesting thing. The majority of my practice in the emergency room predates what in Ohio was called the Ohio Automated Reporting System, and here in Florida is eForce. In the old days, you didn't know who was achieving what controlled substance. Back in about the year 2010 or so, that did come into force in Ohio. And what we found was that a lot of the narcotics that people were getting were coming from various places, clinics in Florida, believe it or not, other places. And it was incredible, because now we could track, and we could actually see that somebody was coming in sometimes just for those 20 Vicodin, believe it or not, a whole ER visit, and the expense and time of an ER visit just for somebody who was addicted to narcotics to come in for 20 Vicodin. Crazy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cut you off there, because I think that's the broader war on drugs, and where marijuana kind of has sat in it. I found all of that very interesting. I see there's a couple comments in the chat. Did anybody, I asked a couple questions, and before I invite Mike to talk, does anybody else have any blanks in their knowledge that are just burning that we should ask about drug scheduling, what doctors are doing right now with other drugs? And I recognize, Barry, that you said you're not writing a lot of these scripts right now, but you maintain an active DEA license. So, any other questions?
Jody, I want to add one thing. I don't use my DEA license, but if and when they reschedule to 3, then I may need it again, right? And no, seriously, there's many a cannabis clinician who have given up their DEA license, and it does cost money. And you have to take a CME class for it too. So many have given it up, but if they reschedule to 3, then I would suspect you would have to reapply and get it back. So I've never given it up, and I think for that I'm happy. Plus, I think just to clarify what's happened at this point is that the Health and Human Services department has made a recommendation to the DEA based upon their evaluation of the history and the science to consider rescheduling. Hasn't happened. The DEA can sit on it. They can reject it. So I think it's really important that we know at what stage that we're actually in. But we're thrilled that the evaluation by the science shows that it should be changed. Now, of course, the controversy, and I know you're going there, is descheduling, of course, which is what most of us advocates want, gives us a lot more. How do we get there? You know, and is rescheduling worth the incremental step by step, or does it actually complicate things? And I know Dana was making that reference last night, so I will segue right back to you.
There's Mike Crowitz. All right, Mike Crowitz, I think that's a fabulous time for you to step in. Mike, if you, in 10 or 15 minutes, I'm likely to ask you a question. In less than 20 minutes, I'm likely to let everybody else loose on you. So that gives you kind of your, we may run over an hour, but we will only do it with consent. So we're going to try and make sure that we have 20 minutes for questions. So Mike, I'm going to turn the mic over to you. Barry, you and I are muted then. All right, Mike, please.
Thanks, Jody. And thanks, Barry. That was really great. Great introduction and a really great sort of starting point for me. I think the first thing I'd like to do is take us back to the history and pick up where you left off. You know, the Schaefer Commission, that was part of a promise that was made at the passage of our Controlled Substances Act. When the federal law was passed in 1971, there was a promise made that cannabis would only be temporarily placed in a control until it could be properly evaluated by this commission. And it was not just a bipartisan commission; it was led by Republican former governor, as was stated. So this was something that just how do you come back from that? When you're making a promise, the law is passed based on that promise, and then you don't keep that promise, you've still got the law. I mean, we kicked out the president, but that didn't get rid of the law. Kicking out the law is considerably harder than kicking out the president, it turns out. So rewinding a little bit before that, one of the reasons why that promise was so important in the Controlled Substances Act was because the previous law was found unconstitutional. Now, this is a little bit before a lot of people's sort of collective memory on the cannabis movement before 1970. But the origins of our marijuana federal law, there were a bunch of states complaining to the federal government, like, hey, we need a law. We're in Texas on the border and we need a law. And there was a guy 3 weeks ago and he had a bale of hay on his shoulder and he was Mexican and we need to be able to arrest someone like that. We couldn't even arrest him. We had to watch him walk right by us with that bale of hay on his shoulder. I mean, I swear to God, I'm not even exaggerating the story. California, Texas, there were letters sent to the, at that time, it was the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger. And they received a bunch of letters from state, attorneys general. And the party line at that time, this is before 1938, was that's a state issue. That's not a federal issue. And the reason why it was still not on the books, as I'm told from the professors that work on such things, when they passed the omnibus drug law, which would be at that point the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Control Act, they left out cannabis because cannabis was being locally produced, as in produced in the United States by pharmaceutical companies, Park Davis and Eli Lilly. There were 100 cannabis products on the shelf in 1914. 100 products on the shelf in American pharmacies. And most of those were available based on pharmaceutical grade cannabis grown in the United States. Around 1900, Park Davis and Eli Lilly perfected growing cannabis inside the United States. They sent a team to India to learn what they were doing wrong because cannabis Americana wasn't worth using. So the Harrison Narcotics Act is passed in 1914. And why wasn't cannabis put in? Again, because this was a tax act. The Harrison Narcotics Act is a tax act. And they felt that adding cannabis, which was locally grown in the United States, would undermine their constitutional authority of their act, which is mostly over substances that were imported. It was an import kind of based tariff tax kind of law, as I understand it. So, you know, cocaine and heroin and all these things, there was never a very big production in the United States, but cannabis there was. So 1938 rolls around and they got creative. Most people don't know this. They usually find it pretty fascinating that the Marijuana Tax Act was passed based on the Machine Gun Tax Act that was passed not that long before that. And the idea of the machine gun tax was they didn't want people to have machine guns, but they didn't want to pass a law to outlaw them either. So they just made a tax, and then they didn't give anyone the tax stamp. Boom, machine guns are illegal. It's exactly what they did with cannabis. They made a tax stamp, and they very, very selectively issued them. Pharmacies that were still carrying cannabis could get the tax stamp. Doctors that were still prescribing cannabis could get the tax stamp. Producers that were still producing cannabis could get the tax stamp. But you certainly couldn't get a tax stamp, you know, to do anything other than what was already being done. Essentially, they choked out cannabis until it was dead, basically in 1941, when the cannabis was removed from the pharmacopoeia and from the formulary of the United States. Because after that, if you were a new doctor coming through, you wouldn't be trained on cannabis. It wouldn't even exist in your universe. The 1938 Marijuana Tax Act that was passed based on that machine gun tax was found unconstitutional in 1969 based on Timothy Leary's case. And it was found unconstitutional because Tim Leary proved or showed that he had to incriminate himself to comply with the tax, because he had to put on the form that you were doing something illegal so that you can get the bloody stamp. It was a catch-22. And I guess they were right back in 1914 when they didn't want to add cannabis, that it would undermine their constitutional authority of their law, right? So here in 1970, we have no federal law. The marijuana law has been found unconstitutional, and they're going to, you know, basically grandfather in marijuana based on an unconstitutional prior law. That's why they promised to review it and to assess it and put it where it properly went. Also, in the law itself, in the Controlled Substances Act, was very careful language to be able to base on an evidence-based process, a scientific process, the placement of drugs in various schedules based on their level of harm that they could produce. Also, the 1971 Controlled Substances Act was designed and written to implement the Drug Control Treaty that was signed in 1961, that basically had no one even knew about. I mean, think about it. If you want to know what the impact of the treaty alone is, well, there it is. From 1961 to 1971, there was zero impact. Nobody even knew we signed it, except when we implemented it by creating the Controlled Substances Act. Then the treaty became very, very important in US law because of how it's written into the Controlled Substances Act. So NORML, bless their heart, at that time, I think it was called National Organization for the Repeal of Marijuana Laws, before they changed it to the Reform of Marijuana Laws later, took them right to court, but focused in on the scheduling. I think, you know, as a Monday morning quarterback, I would have loved if they had done at least maybe even focused on a constitutional, you know, a flat out a constitutional argument, you know, a constitutional challenge to the very underpinning of the CSA. It's you know, constitutional authority, because it was somewhat circular, using the treaty as somewhat of its, and part of its constitutional authority was always on a poor footing. And I think it was always vulnerable. But nonetheless, they put all their eggs in one basket. By this date today, in 2023, I would have no idea how much money we as the movement have spent on this, but it has to be in the tens of millions of dollars at this point, since 1971, that we've fought to get them to follow their own procedures that they wrote into the Controlled Substances Act. Because I said there was procedures within the act to make sure that something didn't get put in the incorrect schedule that violated the scientific norms and evidence base of the time. In 1988, we had a law judge, Judge Young. Judge Young ruled that cannabis was safer than many of the foods that we commonly eat. It was safer than eating potatoes, for gosh sakes. He ruled that cannabis should be immediately rescheduled, and the DEA took him to court, took their own law judge to court, and found that they had more authority than their own administrative law judge. The administrators of the DEA could simply overrule their own law judge. So I say all this, and I think the reason why I'm emphasizing some of these points is because I just read today, I wanted to review our opposition, our actual opposition, and where they're at on this. There was a bill that was put into Congress to prevent the the DEA from being able to do their job here. There is a letter sent to the DEA that we should keep it in Schedule 1. This is, of course, sort of Kevin Sabet world. And I wanted to read their arguments and know where they were coming from. And the main argument that they had was, oh, they're rushing into this. This isn't, something that's accurate, or it's just political. And, why are we rushing into this? And oh my God, I wanted you to have a real feel. I wanted to drag you through the last 100 years of this, this effort, because it is really, really beyond any amount of human frustration to be able to, tolerate this amount of bullshit for this long. But that's where we're at. So, yeah, this is not a whim. This is a process that was built into the law. I want to just say a few things quickly about where we're at here and what is sort of one-off, what is, sort of a precedent-setting moment. We've never had a president support rescheduling before. President Carter supported legalization of an ounce of cannabis, said that the penalties for cannabis should be no worse than the possession of it itself. That the drug shouldn't be less dangerous than the penalty for possessing it. And that's where he came down on legalizing 1 ounce. That wound up, ironically, being a scandal that NORML was in the middle of, that took out his marijuana effort in 1978, 79. His top advisor was caught doing cocaine at a High Times party, and Keith Stropp, the head of NORML, left them out to dry with the media, which immediately just tanked the legalization of cannabis for 25 or so years. But here we are. But I wanted to, just really kind of give you a feel for that. And I totally just lost my train of thought. Now I was going to say something else about NORML, and I completely lost it. I apologize.
Well, we'll be nice to NORML
You will be
today.
nice to me.
They're doing the best they can, just like the rest of us. So we are in Schedule 1. I'm like, oh my God, if Kevin Sabat wrote a letter, Florida Can's got to write a letter, because anything they can do, we should do better. But when I spoke to you the other week and was like, holy shit, Schedule 1 is gonna taking it from Schedule 1, where I have state protections built into my Constitution, to Schedule 3 is going to upend my world. So start from there.
Yeah, I don't expect it to upend your world. It's a little bit difficult to give you complete peace of mind, but suffice it to say that the mechanisms and controls that we put in at the state level and the laws that we've enacted at the state level were done in such a way as to avoid the federal government's oversight and interdiction because of the Constitution of the United States. The activists at the time, back, it was the Prop 215 days. You're talking about Dennis Perone out in California with Dr. Micarea. And this was the 13th initiative in the cannabis movement. 13 tries before we finally got one to pass. And they decided to try to figure out how to do medical, how can we get around the DEA? How can we get around the prescription pad? And as I understand it, they did sort of a pilgrimage down to visit with the Attorney General of California. They had a sit down. That must have been such an interesting meeting. The Attorney General of California and Dennis Perone and Dr. Micarea, the three of them. But it was, I believe, the AG that recommended to them, hey, if you get away from the prescription pad, if you have your law based on recommending cannabis, have the doctor just simply make a recommendation for cannabis, and have that written recommendation be the structure of your law, you'll get away from the prescription pad. The prescription pad is just that. It's literally a pad that has DEA numbers on it. When you write something on it, you're under the authority of the DEA. If you write right now a prescription for cannabis on a prescription pad and you hand it to the patient with the intent of the patient filling that out in the pharmacy, that's a felony, because as Schedule 1 is set up, you have to have prior permission from the DEA before you can even write the prescription. That at least goes away with Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. That's a special thing for Schedule 1. But Schedule 1, you have I'm going off in the wrong direction. I'm sorry. I don't have enough cannabis. Believe it or not, this is a problem for me this week. I've run out of cannabis and I'm suffering pretty bad right now, getting in fights with my wife and everything else here. So I apologize. But yeah, back on point. The Schedule 1 status of cannabis is actually much more harsh than Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 in the respects that you're talking about and you're asking about. Do you need to all of a sudden need to use a prescription pad? Are you going to have to conform with FDA approved medicines and stuff? That is times 10 in Schedule 2 from Schedule 3, and times, I don't even know, some close to infinite number when you go from Schedule 2 to Schedule 1. In other words, the most restrictive place we could ever be with regard to those rules is right now where we are in Schedule 1. The most enforceable place that we could ever be for violating those rules is right now here under Schedule 1. The protections that we put into the state laws to get around that, to have a recommendation and to allow for patients and doctors and caregivers to be protected from arrest. The state doesn't actually provide the cannabis, but they do carve out the their protection from arrest or give you a immunity from arrest. That's within their authority. You have to look at all this stuff in terms of levels of authority and in terms of law. And I think I'll say this piece and then I'll go back to questions again. The law as it stands right now, man, I'm losing it more than I've ever lost it before. I really apologize to you guys. I'm gonna take a hit or two as you do questions, but listen. So man, I'm glad you're bearing with me. I'm glad you're being patient with me. My brain is just having so much trouble right now.
I wish I was in the studio. I wish I was in the studio with you right now, Mike. We'd take care of it.
Yeah,
I'm
man.
right
I hear you, man. I hear you.
They have state dose limits. I'm
this
messing with you.
is what it looks like when you can't. So, all right. So I'm trying here. So,
state, right?
I'm sorry.
In a state where there isn't safe legal access.
Yeah. So the state. All right. So that's what I started to talk about. I was talking about the state not having to arrest you. So the federal government has its law. Its law is supreme. The state cannot violate the federal law. Full stop. But what the state can do is actually not enforce the law. There's nothing in the U.S. federal law that says that states have to enforce federal law at all, ever. They don't even have to help the federal government enforce federal law, ever. That's the separation of powers between the state and the federal government. And the states don't have to enforce their laws that would, in some way further implement the federal law, because that's the way it works. The federal government has a certain amount of drug enforcement that it does, and then the state picks it up from there. And you have to realize most of the arrests that occur are on the state docket, not on the federal docket, right? So the state, by immunizing you and not arresting you and giving you this ability to have this law under recommendation to allow you to escape the wrath of the federal government under Schedule 1, I think hopefully you're seeing, what I'm saying here, that if it applies to Schedule 1, it's going to apply just as much, if not more, to Schedule 2, just as much, if not more, to Schedule 3. Any arguments that they would have to undermine our law would be undermined by the changing of the schedule, making it more lax. So that's the first part. The second part is that man, I cannot get my brain to the second part now.
Well, Mike, let us ask some questions, because I think that's you take a bong hit. Josephina, are you with me, Josephina? Calling you out.
I am
She's-
with you.
All right. So Josephine and I have spent an awful lot of time in Tallahassee, where we have a program that has done everything the opposite of the way California did. Our doctors have to write a recommendation, but it's called an order. They don't do a recommendation anymore. They order it. And they have certain amounts they're allowed to order, and we have limits. So when Josephine and I start talking about Schedule 1 or Schedule 3, and they talk about Schedule 3, I get just as freaked out. And Josephine, you had some concerns about Schedule 3. I'm going to give you the floor for a minute, and we'll see if we can't. And Mike, hop in. Josephine, breathe long enough to let him.
Well, I think my biggest concern is basically what's going to happen to our state program. So if it goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, is that going to change the criteria of how we get our recommendations and our orders? Like, are all physicians now going to be able to just write an order regardless of whether they've actually received any training? Some folks might say, well, yeah, that's a great thing, right? Docs should be docs. I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. I kind of like the fact that physicians need to have special training when it comes to cannabis. I guess for me, we have literally fought so hard for what we have. And I'm concerned with what would that unwind at the state level.
So my short answer is nothing. I think that the state laws being the way that they are, written to, essentially avoid the federal government's ability to foreclose on them and to shut them down. I mean, that's how they were designed. It wasn't a very comfortable thing for the states to have to do that, but that's what they did. We have 38 states that have done that. Those programs under state law, I think if they're in any jeopardy, it's going to be from the urge of state regulators and state officials that are going to want to change the law. But the way the law is written now, it shouldn't be really affected by the schedule change directly. I think, going back to
I think that's my biggest concern, Mike, is what will our Florida legislators do? That's my biggest concern.
Let me go back to the thought that I lost before, which was I was trying to pick up the second part of the sort of the big picture with regard to the federal government and the states. And the way that drugs are scheduled, you can look at them in sort of groups. There's the Schedule 1 group. It's all by itself, very unique. But then there's Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 as a group. They have very common characteristics in terms of how big a safe you need to store the cannabis, and a lot of things that you don't see, like international reporting requirements and import-export rules and quotas and stuff that are written into treaty that are enforced at the federal level that are invisible to the states. So that's sort of the big groups. Schedule 3, 4, and 5 are in somewhat of a group, and I think when you heard the drugs that are in 3, 4, and 5, you can sort of feel that they're sort of a mishmash. They don't seem to even make sense how they're sorted in 3, 4, and 5. And I think the reason why that doesn't really cause much problems is because 3, 4, and 5 aren't that much different in the way they require security and the way that they require the oversight and management. For example, Schedule 3, you can now write a refill prescription, where Schedule 2 you can't. You can go to a doctor and get a prescription basically for like a year, and go to the pharmacy every month and pick up your supplies. Well, doesn't that sound a lot like a dispensary? Right now, that's how we kind of do it. And I think that's the thing. When you look at the spec.
Yeah,
well,
but Mike,
listen,
but it's no regard for human health and or risk of addiction. So as a doctor, there is no rhyme, no reason. And we all know that there's irrationality all throughout the system. And I want to bring up an elephant in the room, everybody. And Hector, I see your question in there. If you want to talk about abuse in Florida right now, I'm going to call out the hemp space. And you know, and in the green room this morning, I showed what I obtained at my local smoke shop yesterday, and I can't show it tonight, but it's, of course, we've all seen it. The hemp-derived THCA, okay, 24.7 whatever percent, called sativa, okay, and it has a big Cali sticker on it with a marijuana leaf and the exclamation point. We all know what it looks like, okay? And that's obtained in Florida every day in about every smoke shop, okay, here in the state right now. And you know, the guy was nice. And listen, every time a smoke shop comes into my area, I go out, I say hello, I drop off my cards, I let them know who I am. We discuss a little bit about their Delta 8 products, you know. And listen, I wouldn't have bought the product, but he gave it to me. He goes, try it. Am I going to try it? No, because I don't know what it is.
So,
But no, I don't know what it
stuff.
is. But the point is, it could be California weed, I guess, that hasn't been lit yet or combusted. And I guess that's what I'm supposed to think it is. So I don't know. That's what troubles me. Is the unregulated market right now, and there's no schedule for that.
Then my other question is, what is Schedule 3 going to do as far as the distribution points? Like, are we going to now have cannabis in pharmacies? You know, are we going to be?
And Cindy asks, are dispensaries going to be regulated, like turned into pharmacies and be regulated like them? Though, Cindy, I think we probably already have some regulations around the dispensaries in Florida that are greater than regulations at a pharmacy. So I think that one I'm pretty confident about. You don't have a pharmacy that has to have a guard on 24 hours a day. They do it because their insurance requires it, but I don't think it's written in the law.
I think
listen, doctors, I'm sorry, Mike, I'm gonna let you get back, but doctors need training. Yes, period. Absolutely. No doctor that doesn't learn medical cannabis in med school or no residency program for it should be allowed, quite frankly, to be involved in recommending cannabis to patients with no training. So there are tons of issues. It's not going to hit med school and or that type of training for a number of years. So it's going to be a mess, you know, in a lot of ways. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, my big concerns are the physicians and the distribution points.
let me tell you a story, and I think it might help you on every one of these points. Believe it or not, it ties together. Tell me at the end if it doesn't tie these all in a bow. But CBD became an issue when for the FDA to consider scheduling, when it became a prescription drug because of Epidiolex. Epidiolex, for those that don't know, a 30-second history, it's a whole cannabis extract preparation produced by GW Pharma in the UK, based on plants that were produced by American expats in the Netherlands that express themselves mostly as CBD. So when you do an extract of the plant, you get a very purified CBD extract straight from the plant. That is the patented plant that they use to produce the CBD that's pure enough for the FDA to consider a purified drug. That was brought to the United States by parents for their children that were suffering from Dravet syndrome and terrible seizures and dying and having parts of their brain removed for lack of treatments available. And they brought this drug into the United States as a test and approved. Now they need to put in a schedule, right? Or not. The FDA looked at it. By the evidence-based process of the CSA, they determined it should not be scheduled. It's not a substance of any real abuse potential. It should not be scheduled. What do you say, DEA? DEA said, well, it's not even in the treaty, but in the treaty, so vague, it was written in 1961. They didn't even know what THC was yet. They wrote it as extracts of cannabis. So as an extract of cannabis, you could actually think of CBD as in the treaty. So it should be scheduled something. So the FDA said, okay, we'll put it in Schedule 5. Then the Farm Bill was passed, and it was then now CBD could be said to be a product of hemp. So if it's a product of hemp and it's legal under federal law, then all of a sudden now, you know, it doesn't belong in any schedule because it goes back to the FDA's approval. And the reason why I brought this up in the context of what we're talking about is two things. One is I defy you to tell me the difference when it was not scheduled, when it was scheduled, and when it was not scheduled again. You didn't notice. You didn't notice in the pharmacies. You didn't notice in the access points. You didn't notice anywhere. And where did we see FDA come down? FDA's come down consistently on products that hurt people. They will follow the bodies to the source and they will arrest you. And they will have no shortage of police for that. They got their own police force for that. But as far as like the FDA, you know, coming after stuff that other than that, the only other thing that they do in sort of a Pavlovian way is come after those that make medical claims. So if you put out a product and you say it cures such and such a condition, and you try to sell it that way, they're going to come after you again with unlimited resources. So that's it. The only way I can appease your thoughts there on, you know, what could happen to the doctors, what could happen to these, you know, these access programs that we have. Two things. One is that the federal government in their contemplated bills in Congress lean on the states. They lean on the programs. They preserve them and they try to work through and from them as we deschedule. And then the second thing is that oh God, and there goes my brain again.
No, actually, listen, Mike, you were spot on. And listen, what you know is all that history, and I got it. And they fucked up. Excuse my. Oh, I'm sorry, Jody. Now you can't post it. I apologize. No, I'm teasing, but I'm not. I apologize. I try to keep that in. But they messed up with the Farm Bill, okay? They didn't understand the consequences of the Farm Bill. Nobody anticipated that the glut of CBD, that wonderful anti-inflammatory, okay, that wonderful antidepressant and anti-anxiety agent and all the other beautiful things that CBD and CBG and CBC and all those other minor cannabinoids do, okay? Yes, wonderful in the health and wellness market. But a glut is a glut, okay? So all of a sudden the chemists got smart, okay, and say, well, we know what to do with your glut. We'll convert it into all this stuff, okay? And Delta-8 is stuff, okay? And 10 and 6 and HHC and O, and I know there's a difference because some are synthetic and some are in the plant to very minute amounts, okay? But what concerns me is now that what's called the hemp-derived Delta-9 market, very prominent in the edible world, okay? Also Delta-8 gummies. These convert in the liver to 11-hydroxy. It's stronger, it lasts longer, and it should not be available without the appropriate instruction upon what's going on. And no one is going to tell me, and I don't want to get myself in more trouble than I'm already in with a lot of my friends in the hemp space. And I have a lot of friends in the hemp space, and I want them to be able to earn a legitimate living. But to me, they should be earning their legitimate living on a product that's tested at the state level, right? To make sure there's no contaminants. And if they say it's a Delta-8 product, then it should be Delta-8. Because I think most of the Delta-8 products have a lot of Delta-9 in them, or whoever knows what else, because they're not tested. And to me, my patients are held to a standard of medicines and a dosage cap on THC amounts, right? That really, and no one should have to go to the illegitimate market to meet their needs. And I just want what everybody wants, which is safe, legitimate, tested product, okay, and to have a safe market. And I also want honesty at the purveyor level, so purveyors don't say to a consumer that walks into their smoke shop with a big Delta-8 sign hanging out that all THCs are alike. And we all know that goes on, and that purveyor has the responsibility to be honest with his consumer and to tell the consumer exactly what the products are. But that to me is the big gorilla in the room, and we know there's a big conference coming up in Tallahassee, National Marijuana Business Association, and it'll be very interesting to see what direction that our legislature is going to go taking care of that. And I know it's a little bit off topic as far as scheduling is concerned, but to me, it's those unregulated cannabinoids that are really the to me the big elephant in the room.
I think you're right on. And give me just 2 seconds here to wrap up, Jody. I think you're right on. And I think what you really need to watch out for is the Farm Bill and how they handle this, because there's a lot of what you just said. There's a lot of that out there. And I agree with you. And I imagine everybody here agrees with you. But you see how strong that sentiment is and how easily that could wind up with an overcorrection. So I would warn everybody to sort of watch the bill and watch for an overcorrection. But I said earlier that there was no real debate about rescheduling versus descheduling. And I want to explain that, because in the federal government, in the legislature and the Congress, we have descheduling bills. There are no rescheduling bills. It's only descheduling bills, and various bills, various different approaches. They argue over tax levels and stuff, but there's literally no argument over whether we're going to deschedule or whether we want to deschedule. Descheduling is our main mission. And rescheduling is something that we've worked on forever since 1971, but don't confuse that with this being our effort. This isn't. This the president asked the AG's doing it. They got the FDA and the HHS to look at it according to CESA. They did. They're going to come back with a recommendation. The DEA is going to do what it does under law. And we literally have nothing to say until the DEA says what it's going to say. What we're doing, Veterans Action Council, is hoping for the best, that the Schedule 3 placement will be accepted, but planning for the worst. And if it's rejected and they say, oh, no, we need to keep it in Schedule 2, which is a possibility that they might say that, we're preparing to fight that. But, should we go to Schedule 3, the focus then just goes right back to descheduling. Hopefully this won't, the success. I think it's interesting, like the cannabis industry was bolstered by this news. Their stocks went up, but the cannabis reform community went like nuts. They just totally burnt, fused out with fear. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that you need to look at. I don't want to discount all the fears out there. They're very rational. And as I said, I think you really need to look at the state legislatures and make sure you keep them in line as we change the federal law, because that's where the problems are going to be, I think. The federal government, I've been tracking the FDA, I've been attending their meetings and watching them as close as I possibly can. And quite seriously, there's no evidence whatsoever of them gearing up for a fight. There's no evidence whatsoever that they would in some way change the behavior that they've already had. Meaning, if you do what's in the state law to do the medical cannabis program, you do it well, then it should continue on pretty good. I personally, I'm working on the future of how do we really dynamically put traditional medicine into the contemporary, medicine cabinet properly. And that requires international, national, and state cooperation. We're just not there yet. But certainly Schedule 3 is a step in that direction, not in the other way. Even the most ardent of our leaders in our movement, when I asked them straight up, oh, would you oppose it and join Kevin Sabet in the fight to keep it Schedule 1? No, we wouldn't do that. No. So, it may have some downside to this change, but I think you're going to find a hell of a lot more upside than the downside.
Well, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the majority of the folks on this call are from Florida, and we're talking about the Florida legislature. And I think that is where the major crux of our particular concerns come in, because that's what you were saying. Federally,
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
No, listen. It's politicians. It's politicians in general, and pharma in particular as well. So we don't trust either, and they're bad players. They've proven to be.
Let me.
I'll be honest with you though, Mike. I've never had one moment of fear. Not one moment. Not one iota. Not one. I've always felt that with honesty and integrity, and everybody knows this. They've heard it out of me. My role in the game is not to be the state's policeman to keep people away from cannabis. My role in 2023 is to be a safety officer and an advocate and an educator for every single patient, that comes to me wanting to access the safest arrow in my quiver, right? And listen, last night, everybody, you didn't, and it's important, I was in a meeting last night, or not a meeting, Rep Roach had a fundraiser. and I had a chance to see Rep Roach. You know who else I saw, Josephine? Ray Rod. So Chancellor Rodriguez was there. I shook Chancellor Rodriguez's hand. I thanked him for his efforts way back when, and I wanted him to know of the impact that his early program has now what it's become. And he was unbelievably gratified and gracious. Says he hasn't heard that from a whole lot of people, and he appreciated knowing that his efforts were appreciated. Also, Leader Grant was there, Senator Martin, and I passed out cards all over the place. So we're surely going to make sure that we're going to maintain all the efforts that I know all of us want as we go forward.
Well, and
and let me just answer by saying for the foreseeable future, that's the way it's going to be. That your legislature there is going to be paramount to your access for medicinal cannabis patients in the state. Absolutely, for the foreseeable future. I mean, I can't even envision when that's going to change. It's going to take maybe a decade before that situation really changes. And that's being just practical.
You have any thoughts from a national perspective on how the state will act when cannabis is federally Schedule 3 and legal for adults 21 and older to use recreationally? Because we are in Florida and we've gotten some great comments. It is 8 o'clock, and I will understand if anybody's not as geeky as I am. I'm going to try and run this clock an extra few minutes. We started about 10 minutes late, so because I want to hear some of these points. So what do you think about descheduling? We're going to put that one on the back burner. So at this point, we are hearing from Hector, descheduling is like deregulation. Is that what you think? You want to expound on that a minute, Hector?
Yeah, sure. Basically, if there is no regulatory structure to meet descheduling, then it's just essentially a regulation scheme. Except that we know that there is always interest from law enforcement to regulate it instead. But on that note, I think Dr. Berry is what he's saying is the most important part, right? We want product to be safe. We want the dosage and really the medical benefits to be better understood and widely understood, because that will lower education, will lower risk. But ultimately, if the regulators, that is legislatures, aren't going to actually put in their own regulation, then it is up to us. And I just want to feedback from that. What does that look like, and what does it look like around the country?
Well, the way Representative Nancy Mace from South Carolina has probably arguably the best descheduling bill, at least the one that Veterans Action Council seems to like the best. And what it does is it essentially grandfathers in all the medical cannabis programs. And not only that, but it creates a sort of FDA rules around those programs and instructs the FDA to sort of restructure itself as needed in order to sort of channel in products like the ones we're using in medical cannabis and dispensaries into the mainstream. It sort of envisions like what I was sort of describing before, a period of transition to where we would finally, incorporate cannabis as a full incorporated plant-based medicine like we would do with anything else. I like the way my buddy Kenzie from Barcelona, one of our team members at the UN, he likes to compare it to chili peppers, capsicum. And chili peppers are something you grow in your garden. You can grow it in your garden. You can, put it in a little buckets and sell it at the little garden, shows and community sales and stuff. But you can also extract a very strong medicine from it. That is an unregulated medicine that, again, is just something you can sell or use as long as you're obeying the rules of any kind of produce that you would sell. It's only when you actually produce a medicine from that and then you make medical claims that you then have to have a prescription. And even I found the capsicum and hot chili pepper really fascinating, because you take it one step further and it becomes a weapon, and it's actually covered under international laws about weapons, the pepper spray and stuff. So, but anyway, that's how it should be handled. That's how the treaty handles it, by the way, based on how the end use, based on what it's practically going to be applied for. And I think that the issues that you're talking about with hemp and Delta 8 and these runaway issues are for that reason, because the law was passed with envisionment of hemp being used for food, fiber, and fuel, as Jack used to say. And instead, it sort of tilted the entire industry of cultivation towards everybody growing for CBD. If those products were able to be easily managed in some sort of control mechanism for all cannabis based on end use, then we would get rid of those problems. It wouldn't, the drugs and stuff that they're selling that are from hemp are really sketchy, some of them, where they're not even sold as a drug, they're not sold as a food, they're not sold as a medicine, they're just sold as a hemp product or whatever, some, what is it, X, THC X or something like that. So it is quite scary. Yeah, it's a buyer beware market out there, and I don't think that the solutions to that don't really seem very clear in any of the current legislation. So I'll be very interested to see what they come out with next year. But that's the idea, is to, at least at first, to lean on the states and to use the state laws as the backbone of it, not just the model, but as the structure of the federal policy. Where they really have trouble is on equity issues and tax issues and stuff.
So it turns out that we're all very libertarian about our pot. We just want it, and we just want it, and we want nice people to have it, and we want nice people to grow it, and we want as little regulation as possible, and because only nice people are growing it.
Just like when Bolas said, we gave it away because it's fun.
Because it's fun. And I think we should have those conversations on the floor of the Florida Senate more often, and maybe we'll get an opportunity to. Cindy, thanks for your comments in the chat. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, it was a great conversation. Thank you, Mike, for all the info.
But I'm not sure I'm done yet. But it does make me think, okay, if this does happen, we need to be prepared to work on it at the Florida legislature to make sure that we protect our program. But regardless of what happens at the federal level, we're going to be doing that anyhow this legislative session, as they look at legalization, this session and next session as they look at legalization. The other thing that I thought about, Cindy, was maybe, again, that we could do some kind of letter to the DEA with some of the information to kind of counter the lies of the Sabets, because Hector's right. This scheduling is really about how you're going to regulate it. And so when Mike says, boy, it'll be a whole lot better when it's regulated like Schedule 3 than when it's regulated by Schedule 1, he can't possibly be wrong. But the big factor, as we pointed out to those who were here early when Dr. Berry was talking, was propensity for abuse. And so as long as marijuana is illegal and someone is being arrested for illegal use of marijuana, then it has a high propensity for abuse. And now we're right back where we started from.
And I do want to jump in and say that personally, I am excited that the federal government, for the very first time, is acknowledging the therapeutic value of this plant, and that they are catching up with what humans have intuitively known for thousands of years. So that part I do want to underscore, because it is a giant leap, not a step, but like a giant leap forward to have that acknowledgement come from highest office of the land.
Well,
So-
and he gets no flack from his attorney general because his attorney general's kind of met Mike and Kathy.
So
So
let
it's
me
attorney general doesn't know.
let me talk a little bit about what I think might be some of the interesting, kind of what might happen next things. And I think it'll help you maybe focus on what you might be able to do at the state level in your legislature. We've been working with Adam Smith on state pacts. I don't know if you've read any of that, but the idea of a state pact would be like having a country, having a state like California. It's bigger than some countries, so ballpark. But having a state like California and a state like Indiana, for example, have a state pact where they can transfer cannabis product and obey the same rules and conform to certain standards for trade back and forth on cannabis for medical use. That's a state pact. And he's already got a state pact in process in, I think, Oregon, Hawaii, and California, and one or two others. I'm not sure caught quite up to speed on his successes so far. But these state pacts are a way to produce the ability to have commerce now between states, but they take an interesting added meaning after rescheduling, where then these states would be, first of all, would a patient in, let's say, Florida, who's under a state medical cannabis program, or even in a state like Idaho, for that matter, with no state medical cannabis program, if they were to order cannabis from a dispensary in California, could that be a legal transaction after rescheduling? And that's a really interesting open question that we're not going to really know the answer to. Even if that is true and is legal, and it does float, which I think it might, I'm certainly looking forward to pressing it. But even if it doesn't float, or if it does float, there's other considerations after rescheduling that states could enter into a pact, and before any change, real substantive change in federal law, could at least make state to state rules on medical cannabis. Like I said, barring some federal, change in program, the FDA coming up with some wonderful cannabis program or something all of a sudden. I don't see them pulling a rabbit out of the hat. Like I said, I see them leaning on the states. So that's one. And then another one that came up was Carl Olson in Iowa with his state exemption. And that's a very interesting one, where it's a part of the Controlled Substances Act, just like the treaty stuff. It's written in there, but activists over the years really never focused on it. And it's a place in the Controlled Substances Act where states can apply for exemption for their law, that they're doing a law that's protecting public safety, ensuring the health and welfare of their citizens, and therefore under the Controlled Substances Act, they can rightfully ask for exemption for that law under the federal statute, make it legal, remove the air quotes. And that would be something that would apply really, really well after rescheduling, to get rid of all the rough edges where cannabis doesn't fit into Schedule 3, 4, or 5, box, and a way to produce conformed, well thought through sort of patchwork, if not national, regulatory schema that would protect consumers and make sure doctors had training and everything else. So I would focus on those things as a potential place to do that. The other thing that I'm working on is cannabis appellations. And the reason why I'll just mention that here is because it has the same sort of checkerboard effect. We're working on that in California. It's a certification and protection for a geographically specific product. Think about like champagne or Rufford cheese. And the application of that would be, if you want to buy something, California cannabis in France, you want it to actually be California cannabis. And that the only way to do that would be have the French government and the US government cooperate and enforce that. Right now, for example, I watched a show the other day where bootleg aftermarket crap from California that didn't make the shelf, or whatever was thrown off the shelf, wound up in big FedEx boxes down in Thailand, screwing up their program, undermining their local growers, making it hard for them.
Isn't that exactly what I talked about 20 minutes ago, Mike? that I
Yeah,
found in my
yeah,
local
yeah.
smoke shop? I don't
Yep,
know.
yep. So
But there you
so
go.
that
So
there's a way to
Okay,
get rid
guys.
of it. That program gets rid of it. Just to finish that thought, it connects up right now with the Trade and Patent Office at the U.S. federal level, then obviously under international trade. But there's other instruments that are coming down the pike from the international level on protection of genetic resources, profit sharing, and stuff like that. That's very interesting. Our small farmers, indigenous peoples, people that grow the best cannabis on earth also happen to live in places that were colonial subjects that were just beat up forever, and they still to this day have the potential to grow the best cannabis on earth. If we can protect that, it's a niche market. It's not going to be the Marlboro of cannabis, but just like you have the Marlboro of cannabis now is, we have the supermarket with the wine and the wine boxes or whatever, but people go down the street to a little wine store. There'll be a small niche market for better high-end stuff. And that's what I foresee for cannabis. I foresee, legal cannabis being corporate because you can't avoid it. And you should look to make sure corporate cannabis is safe and everything. But I'll be still looking for the Humboldt, Humboldt Greenbud and the, Acapulco Gold, right?
Right. Okay, very good. Kathy, I saw John in the room there for a minute. We haven't heard anything from you tonight. Are you in a position where you can talk for a second, or are you still, you're kind of in the dark?
Yeah, I was helping her stretch out. She was starting to get a stiff neck, so we just spun the computer around and flopped her in bed.
Fabulous. Glad to hear that you did that. Any last thoughts that Kathy would like you to help her share?
Everything I've read tonight. That's what they were concerned about the kids getting famous.
Oh, she said everything she read today, it seems like
They're more worried
they're
about
more worried about kids getting a hold of cannabis,
being over medicated.
being over medicated.
So it's all about the children. We have the same, it was interesting, Mike said that we're discussing the same, kind of having the same fights, hearing the same thing from a new generation of faces. So that's why I brought all you young, beautiful things here, and I'll let you hear some of the things that old timers like us were saying, and give you an opportunity to put your own spin on it. I think we've heard from everybody tonight. I have made a note of the stuff that was in the chat, and when I send out the recording, I'll make sure that that goes with it. I would like to thank you all for your input tonight. There is no question that moving the ball down the field, Mike Crowd seems to think that this is further than a first down, and that before before most people know it, it'll seem like marijuana is legal and it's everywhere. Oh wait, we're there now. And really, we're just picking up the pieces. So with that, I'll remind that anybody who made it to the end of this program, if you're able to make a donation to Florida Cannabis Action Network at flcan.org, we'd certainly appreciate it. The people who were here tonight are members. They've paid their dues or they contribute something monthly. And that donation, whether it's big or small, we combine all of that work together and we do amazing things. Over the coming weeks, we're going to be standing in court next to plaintiffs that are protecting your gun rights. We're going to be standing in court next to our members who are plaintiffs in that case. We're going to be standing next to our members who are plaintiffs in a case that will protect your occupational rights. These are the new frontier that we have that we're battling for patients here in Florida, and the legalization discussion is right on the cusp. If you are seeing this before October 9th is the last day to register for the Florida Marijuana Business Association conference that Dr. Berry alluded to earlier. That's Medical Marijuana Business Association Conference, MB, not American Marijuana,
MMA.
MMA, Con. And you can find it online. So it's the Florida Medical Marijuana Business Association Conference happening October 16th. A number of the folks on this call are going to be there, including Dr. Barry Gordon as a speaker. Josephine and I will be managing Florida Can. One of our members, Brian Matali, is speaking as a patient and a caregiver in the Panhandle. He was an early adopter. So Florida Cannabis Action Network is about folks who want to do something, and it's about folks who can writing checks so that those who will do it can go out and continue to do it. Thank you all very much for taking your time to be with us tonight.